It's 1964, Detroit Dragway. The staging lanes are packed with the best drag racing teams in the country: Ford, Chevrolet, Pontiac, all of them showing up with factory money, professional drivers, and years of racing experience behind them. And then there's this other team, a group of guys in button-up shirts who spent their Monday through Friday designing family sedans. Engineers. Pocket protector, clipboard-carrying, dyno-obsessed engineers, and they are absolutely destroying everyone. Not by a little, by car lengths, by records that made the previous year's benchmarks look embarrassing, by margins so wide that the competition didn't just lose, they protested, they complained, they demanded the rulebook be rewritten. And here's the thing, the rulebook was rewritten multiple times, specifically to stop these guys. That's the story of the Ramchargers. And if you've never heard that name before, that's actually part of what makes this so fascinating. Because this isn't a story about one legendary race or one famous driver. It's a story about a group of people who were so systematically, relentlessly, almost annoyingly good at what they did that the sport of drag racing had to evolve just to survive them. They didn't just win championships, they invented new categories of racing. They shaped the engineering culture of an entire industry. And they did it while technically being a club, a hobby club of guys with day jobs. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the engineering breakthroughs that quietly changed American motorsports forever. If you're someone who geeks out over the mechanical decisions behind legendary race cars and wants to understand why certain machines dominated entire eras, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Now, you might be thinking, okay, engineers who raced on weekends, sure, that sounds interesting, but dominant enough to force rule changes multiple times? How does that even happen? To understand that, you have to understand the world they were operating in, and that world is a lot stranger than you'd expect. By the late 1950s, drag racing had evolved from illegal street racing into something with actual structure. The National Hot Rod Association, the NHRA, had been sanctioning events since 1951. Tracks were popping up across the country, classes were being defined, fans were showing up. It was becoming a real sport. But here's what most people don't realize about that era. The factories weren't really involved, not officially. In 1957, the Automobile Manufacturers Association made an agreement to step back from factory-backed racing programs. Safety concerns, they said. Bad optics around crashes. Now look, that agreement was about as enforceable as a pinky promise at a street race. Everyone knew manufacturers were still quietly involved, but officially, the factories weren't racing. That's an important distinction, and it's exactly the gap the Ramchargers slipped through. They formed in 1959, not as a corporate initiative, not as a Chrysler marketing project, as a club. A group of Chrysler employees, engineers mostly, who loved racing and wanted to go do it on weekends. Tom Hoover, Dick Maxwell, Tom Coddington, about a dozen guys total, rotating in and out, all sharing the same obsession. They weren't funded by Chrysler in any official capacity, but because they worked there, they had something better than a budget. They had access. Access to dynos, access to machine shops, access to prototype parts that hadn't been seen by the public yet. Access to the kind of engineering infrastructure that independent teams could only dream about. And because they weren't an official racing program, they didn't have the corporate oversight that came with one. No committees approving every modification, no PR department worried about the optics, just engineers doing what engineers do, finding problems and solving them. Their first real race car was a 1949 Dodge, which tells you something about where they started. Not exactly cutting edge. But that's not really the point. What they were building in those early years wasn't a competitive car. It was knowledge. Every run down the strip was a data collection session. Every modification was logged. Every failure was analyzed and documented. While other teams were operating on feel and instinct, experience, feel, and instinct, sure, but still, the Ramchargers were applying the scientific method to drag racing. And at the time, almost nobody else was doing that. By 1962, they were ready to get serious. Chrysler released the 413 cubic inch max wedge engine, and on paper, it was already impressive. 410 horsepower, cross-ram intake manifolds, big valves, aggressive cam timing. But the Ramchargers didn't take it at face value. They took it apart. They mapped every flow restriction. They measured combustion chamber geometry. They identified exactly where efficiency was being left on the table. And then they fixed it. Ported heads, matched manifolds, optimized carburetor setups, all tested on the dyno, all documented with the same rigor they brought to their actual jobs. When they showed up at the track, nobody could figure out what they'd done. The engine looked stock, the car appeared legal, but it was running times that shouldn't have been possible. Their Dodge, nicknamed the High and Mighty because of its radically altered front suspension geometry, started setting records almost immediately. And this is where it gets really interesting, because the speed wasn't just coming from the engine. The Ramchargers had figured out something that seems obvious in hindsight, but was genuinely revolutionary at the time. In drag racing, getting power to the ground matters just as much as making the power in the first place. You can have the most powerful engine ever built, but if your rear tires are spinning at the line, you're losing. The Ramchargers understood weight transfer. They understood that the geometry of the suspension at launch determines how much grip the rear tires generate, and they engineered their car around that insight while everyone else was still in a horsepower arms race. The result? By the end of 1962, they held multiple national records. They were the team to beat. And 1963 was going to be even more interesting. Here's the thing about 1963. It wasn't just a good year for the Ramchargers. It was the year that made the entire drag racing world uncomfortable. Chrysler updated the max wedge to 426 cubic inches. More displacement, more power, and the Ramchargers had been involved in its development from the beginning. They tested the prototypes. They fed back data that shaped the final production version. So when it hit the market, while other teams were still figuring out what they were dealing with, the Ramchargers already knew every secret the engine had. That insider knowledge translated directly to results. NHRA Winter Nationals, Ramchargers. US National Superstock Class, Ramchargers. Elapsed time records that stood for months, Ramchargers. And the competition wasn't weak. Ford had factory-supported efforts. Chevrolet had the Z11 aluminum engine program. Pontiac was pouring serious resources into their Super Duty cars. These weren't backyard operations. These were well-funded teams with real infrastructure and real talent, and none of them could touch the Ramchargers consistently. Now, you might be thinking, okay, if Chrysler's engine was just that much better, doesn't that explain everything? Wasn't it just about having the right hardware? And that's a fair question. But here's what separates a great engine from a dominant race program. Everyone with money eventually gets access to the same hardware. What they don't get access to is the accumulated knowledge of how to extract everything from it. The Ramchargers had months of dyno data, suspension tuning notes, and run-by-run analysis that no competitor could replicate just by bolting in the same engine. The hardware was the foundation. The engineering culture was the building. Let me give you a specific example of how this played out. When most teams made a modification, they tested at the track, see if the elapsed time improved, and draw their conclusions. Simple enough. The Ramchargers went further. They understood the difference between what helps elapsed time and what helps trap speed, and those aren't always the same thing. A change that makes you faster in the first 60 feet might actually hurt your speed at the finish line. A different camshaft profile might improve reaction time performance without doing much for top end. Understanding those distinctions and being able to isolate variables through disciplined testing gave them a level of insight that felt almost unfair. And look, by the time 1964 arrived, everyone in drag racing knew the Ramchargers' name, but nothing could have prepared the competition for what Chrysler unveiled that year. The 426 Hemi. Not an update, not an evolution, a completely different engine architecture. Hemispherical combustion chambers, a design that places the spark plug centrally, allows for larger valves on both sides of the chamber, and creates a more complete, more efficient burn. The result was power numbers that made the max wedge look modest. And the Ramchargers had been testing prototypes for months, providing the kind of real-world racing feedback that no laboratory could replicate. When that Hemi-powered Dodge hit the strip at the 1964 Winter Nationals, the reaction from the crowd was almost confused, because what they were watching didn't look like close racing. It looked like a different sport. Wins by multiple car lengths in heads-up competition, times that made the previous year's records look like they belonged to a different era. According to NHRA records from that season, the Hemi-equipped cars were running elapsed times that were, in some classes, nearly half a second faster than the next best competitor. In drag racing, half a second is not a close race. Half a second is embarrassing. The protests came immediately. Ford filed complaints. Chevrolet followed. The core argument was straightforward. The 426 Hemi wasn't a real production engine. Yes, technically, Chrysler was selling it in street cars, but they were selling it in tiny numbers, barely enough to meet the NHRA's production threshold, and at a price point that made it effectively inaccessible to regular buyers. It was a racing engine wearing a street car costume, and everyone knew it. The spirit of superstock racing, the idea that these were supposed to be cars that actual people could buy, was technically respected, but practically ignored. Here's what most people don't realize about that moment. The controversy around the Hemi wasn't really about fairness, it was about fear. The other manufacturers had looked at what Chrysler had built, understood they couldn't match it quickly, and decided the fastest path to competitive relevance was a rulebook, not an engine program. Which is a completely rational response, by the way. But it does tell you something about the gap the Ramchargers had created. The NHRA responded in 1965 by either outright banning the Hemi from superstock competition or imposing weight penalties so severe that it couldn't compete effectively. The exact interpretation depended on the specific class and event, but the intent was clear. Slow down Chrysler, give the competition a chance to breathe. And here's where the Ramcharger story really separates itself from every other dominant team in motorsports history. They didn't complain. They didn't lobby. They didn't threaten to pull out of the sport. They looked at the new rules, identified every opportunity hiding inside them, and started engineering a response. If the Hemi was penalized, fine. They'd take what they knew about the max wedge, apply everything they'd learned over the past 3 years, and make that engine competitive again. If weight was now a critical variable, they'd become experts in weight reduction. The rulebook wasn't a wall to them, it was a puzzle. Other teams, when facing sudden rule changes, typically go through a period of adjustment. They figure out the new landscape, recalibrate, maybe have a down season before they find their footing again. The Ramchargers essentially skipped that phase. Their systematic documentation of everything they'd ever tested meant they could look back through years of data and immediately identify which approaches would translate to the new regulatory environment, muscle memory for race cars. And so they kept winning. Different classes, different configurations, same result. The Ramchargers were becoming something the sport hadn't really seen before, a team whose dominance was structural rather than situational, not just good when conditions favored them, consistently excellent regardless of what the conditions were. And that consistency was about to push them towards something that would change drag racing permanently. Look, there's a moment in every sport where someone does something so outside the existing framework that the sport itself has to decide what it is. Baseball had the designated hitter debate. Formula One had ground effect aerodynamics, and drag racing in the mid-1960s had the Ramchargers staring at the rulebook and noticing something everyone else had completely missed. The rules specified minimum wheelbase measurements. What they didn't specify was where within the body the wheels had to sit. Read that again, because that single oversight, that one gap between what the rulemakers intended and what they actually wrote, became the doorway to an entirely new category of motorsport. Here's the engineering logic. If you move the rear axle forward under the body, more of the car's mass sits behind that axle. At launch, when the front of the car lifts and weight transfers rearward, you're now loading tires that are already positioned to receive that weight more effectively. Combined with moving the front axle forward to maintain the minimum legal wheelbase, you get a car that looks profoundly wrong. Wheels pushed toward the middle of the body, overhangs stretched in bizarre proportions, but hooks up off the line like nothing the sport had ever seen. The Ramchargers weren't the only team to eventually figure this out, but they were among the first, and that gap in timing mattered enormously. Because while other teams were still experimenting with the concept, the Ramchargers were already on their second and third generation of refinements. They'd already mapped which axle positions optimized weight transfer for their specific engine output. They'd already tested different front-to-rear ratios. They'd already solved the handling problems that came with radically altered geometry. By the time competitors caught up to where the Ramchargers had started, the Ramchargers were somewhere else entirely. These cars became known as altered wheelbase cars. And then, because they looked so strange, so fundamentally wrong to anyone who expected a car to look like a car, they got a different name, funny cars. Not as a compliment initially, as a description, because they looked funny. Wheels in the wrong place, body proportions that made no visual sense, silhouettes that seemed almost accidental. And yet they were the fastest things on the strip. The NHRA, watching this unfold, eventually did what the NHRA did. It created a new class, formalized the category, set its own rules for what an altered wheelbase car had to be. And in doing so, the sport essentially acknowledged that what had started as a loophole exploit had become something legitimate. Funny car racing today is one of professional drag racing's premier categories, multi-million-dollar operations, top-tier sponsorships, dedicated fan bases. The direct descendant of a group of engineers looking at a rules book and asking, wait, does it actually say that? This is the part of the Ramcharger story that I think gets undersold when people talk about their legacy. Winning championships is impressive. Forcing rule changes is impressive. But accidentally inventing a whole new racing category, that's something else entirely. And they did it not through recklessness or showmanship, but through the same disciplined, systematic process they apply to everything. Someone identified the geometric opportunity. Someone else ran the numbers. They built it, tested it, documented the results, and went racing. The sport responded by building an entire category around what they'd done. Now here's what most people don't realize about the mid-1960s drag racing landscape. The Ramcharger success was actually pulling the entire sport forward in ways that went beyond their own results. Other teams watching them win started asking different questions. Not just what engine should we run, but how should we think about this? Teams started hiring engineers, started keeping better records, started treating testing as a discipline rather than an afternoon activity. The systematic approach the Ramchargers had been running since 1959 began spreading through the sport like a methodology rather than a secret, and the overall level of competition rose as a result. Tom Hoover, who had become the team's undisputed technical leader by this point, was operating at a level that his competitors found genuinely difficult to understand. There's a specific kind of engineering mind that finds signal in noise, that looks at a table of numbers from 50 test runs and identifies the one variable that explains the variance everyone else thought was random. Hoover had that mind, and he was applying it to a sport that was mostly populated by people who operated on gut feel and experience. The combination was almost unfair. Here's a concrete example of how this played out in practice. The rules in the mid-1960s specified what modifications were allowed to cylinder heads. They had to remain technically stock, meaning they had to be the factory casting, recognizable as the factory part. What the rules didn't specify in enough detail was the extent to which material could be removed from inside that casting. The Ramchargers had machinists who had spent years learning exactly how much port volume they could open up, how much combustion chamber material they could reshape, how precisely they could cut valve seats, all while keeping the head identifiable as the factory part. The amount of power this unlocked was significant, not dramatic on any single modification, but accumulated across a dozen carefully optimized details. It added up to a meaningful advantage. Other teams complained. The work was too specialized, too expensive, effectively creating a class within a class where only teams with access to elite machining talent could compete. They weren't entirely wrong. The NHRA responded by tightening head modification rules, specifying allowable tolerances more precisely, requiring more detailed tech inspection. And the Ramchargers, predictably, shifted focus to the next available area of optimization: intake manifolds, exhaust routing, ignition timing curves, fuel delivery systems. Every time one door closed, they found another one open. This is where an analogy might help. Think about tax law. You have the intention behind the tax code, what the legislators were trying to achieve, and then you have the actual written language of the law, which is always imperfect, always containing gaps between intent and execution. Expert tax attorneys don't break the law. They read it more carefully than anyone else and operate in the space between what was intended and what was written. That's exactly what the Ramchargers were doing with the NHRA rulebook. Not cheating, exploiting, reading more carefully, engineering more precisely, existing in the gaps. And look, by 1968, the psychological dimension of their dominance had become a real factor. Teams that lined up next to a Ramchargers car at the staging lights were already fighting a mental battle before the tree dropped. When you have a track record of losing to someone consistently, the expectation of losing becomes part of your preparation. You start running slightly more conservative setups because you're not sure you can win anyway. You second-guess tuning decisions that you'd make confidently against anyone else. The Ramchargers weren't just beating people with their car, they were beating people with their reputation. That kind of dominance is hard to sustain, and the forces that would eventually slow them down were already gathering. Here's the thing about sustained dominance. It creates its own enemies, not just competitors who want to beat you, but institutional forces that have structural reasons to see you slow down. By the late 1960s, the Ramchargers weren't just dealing with faster competition. They were dealing with a sport that had organizationally decided their continued dominance was a problem worth solving at the rulebook level. And simultaneously, they were dealing with something even harder to engineer around: corporate reality. Chrysler's commitment to racing had never been simple. The relationship between the Ramchargers and the company had evolved from informal access to something closer to a real factory program. But it had always been complicated by the fact that Chrysler was, first and foremost, a car company trying to survive in an increasingly turbulent market. By the late 1960s, that market was shifting in ways that made performance racing both more valuable as marketing and more politically difficult as a public position. The muscle car wars were at absolute peak intensity. Ford had the 428 Cobra Jet. Chevrolet had the LS6 454. Mopar had the 440 six-pack and the Street Hemi. Every manufacturer was locked in a horsepower race that was playing out simultaneously in showrooms and on drag strips. The Ramchargers' victories fed directly into Chrysler's marketing narrative. These engines win races. Therefore, these engines are worth buying. The connection between track success and showroom traffic was real and understood by everyone in the industry. But here's what was happening at the same time. Insurance companies had begun treating high-performance vehicles as actuarial catastrophes. A 19-year-old buying a Hemi-powered anything was going to pay insurance premiums that approached the cost of the car itself. Safety advocates, led by voices that had already reshaped the automotive landscape earlier in the decade, were turning attention toward performance vehicles specifically. And emissions regulations, still relatively modest in 1968, were clearly heading toward a future that would make high-output naturally aspirated engines increasingly difficult to produce for street use. Chrysler, reading these signals, began pulling back. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way that corporate support always disappears. Gradually and then suddenly. Budgets that had been reliable became conditional. Programs that had been approved got reviewed. The infrastructure that the Ramchargers had built their later success on started becoming less dependable. And unlike the NHRA rule changes, which the Ramchargers could engineer around, corporate budget cycles weren't a puzzle with an engineering solution. This is the part of the story that most people skip over when they talk about legendary racing teams: the external factors, the market forces, the regulatory environment outside of motorsports entirely. Because those forces don't care how good your dyno data is. They don't respond to clever interpretations of the rulebook. They're just reality, arriving on a schedule you don't control. The Ramchargers navigated this as intelligently as they navigated everything else. They diversified. When Superstock became less financially viable, they explored other categories. They continued development work for Chrysler that wasn't directly connected to their own racing. Engine programs, performance evaluation, the kind of applied engineering that had real value to a manufacturer regardless of what was happening on the strip. Tom Hoover, in particular, remained deeply embedded in Chrysler's engine development culture, contributing to work that would define the company's performance identity for decades. But there's a ceiling on how much you can adapt when the foundational support is eroding. By 1970, the original Ramchargers club was fragmenting. Some members had moved on to other opportunities. Others were still involved, but in reduced capacities. The shared culture that had made them extraordinary, the late nights in the machine shop, the weekend test sessions, the collective obsession with finding the next tenth of a second, was harder to maintain when the institutional support that enabled it was becoming inconsistent. Here's what most people don't realize about what was lost in that transition. It wasn't just a racing team disbanding. It was a specific kind of knowledge generation engine shutting down. The Ramchargers, at their peak, were producing insights about engine performance, chassis dynamics, and weight optimization that fed directly back into Chrysler's engineering culture. Tom Hoover's work on the Hemi, both the racing versions and the street derivatives, was inseparable from the racing laboratory the Ramchargers had operated. When the team fragmented, that feedback loop broke. And you can argue, convincingly, that Chrysler's performance engineering never quite found a replacement for it. Look, the Hemi name itself is worth dwelling on for a moment, because the reason that word still carries weight today, the reason Dodge brought it back in 2003 and built an entire marketing campaign around the name, is directly traceable to what the Ramchargers did with it in the 1960s. They didn't just race a Hemi engine, they turned it into a cultural symbol. Every record they set, every protest they provoked, every rule change they forced added another layer to the mythology of that engine architecture. The Hemi meant something because the Ramchargers made it mean something. That's a legacy that outlasted the team by decades and is still generating revenue for Stellantis today. Now, here's where the story gets philosophically interesting, because there's a genuine debate among motorsports historians about whether the Ramchargers were ultimately good for drag racing or whether their dominance created more problems than it solved. The argument against them, and it's not a frivolous argument, is that sustained, predictable dominance by one team damages the spectacle of competition. Fans want uncertainty. They want to believe the outcome isn't decided before the cars leave the line. When one team wins so consistently that their victory feels inevitable, the drama drains out of the event. Attendance suffers, sponsorship interest weakens, the sport shrinks. There's statistical support for this concern. Periods of extreme competitive imbalance in motorsports consistently correlate with declining fan engagement across Formula One, NASCAR, and NHRA history alike. Parity, even artificial parity created by rule changes, tends to produce better racing as a spectator product. So the NHRA's repeated interventions against the Ramchargers, frustrating as they were for the team, may have been genuinely necessary for the sport's commercial health. The counter-argument is equally compelling. The Ramchargers raised the floor. Every team that adopted their systematic approach became more capable. The sport's overall technical sophistication increased dramatically during the period of Ramchargers' dominance, and that sophistication created a foundation for the professional drag racing industry that exists today. Without them pushing the boundaries stay where they are, and a sport with stationary boundaries eventually becomes something else, a nostalgia exercise rather than a living competition. Both things can be true simultaneously. The Ramchargers were great for the engineering of drag racing, and complicated for the business of drag racing. Holding that tension without resolving it into a simple verdict is actually the honest way to assess their impact. So, what do you actually do with a legacy like this? Because here's the honest challenge with the Ramcharger story. It doesn't end with a championship parade or a dramatic final race, or a moment where everyone in the sport stops and acknowledges what just happened. It ends the way most genuinely important things end, quietly, gradually, with the people involved scattering into other roles, carrying what they learned into contexts that don't carry the same name or the same visibility. Tom Hoover went back to being what he always fundamentally was, an engineer. His contributions to Chrysler's engine development programs continued well into the 1970s and beyond. The knowledge he'd accumulated through years of racing wasn't filed away when the Ramchargers stopped competing at full intensity. It got applied to production vehicles, to internal development programs, to the kind of unglamorous but genuinely consequential work that shapes what cars actually feel like to drive. Engineers who worked alongside him in later years have described the same quality that made him extraordinary on the track: the ability to look at data and see patterns that weren't obvious, to identify the variable that explained the result everyone else was treating as noise. The other team members dispersed similarly, into different corners of the automotive industry, into other racing programs, into retirement. The specific combination that had made the Ramchargers what they were, that particular mix of engineering talent, institutional access, competitive obsession, and collaborative culture, never quite reassembled, which is usually how it goes with genuinely special teams. The ingredients exist independently, the combination is what's rare. Here's what I find most striking when I look at the full arc of what they accomplished. The Ramchargers never had a defining single moment, no miracle on ice, no secretariat at Belmont, no single race or single season that you can point to and say, that right there, that's the moment. Their greatness was distributed across a decade of accumulated decisions, each one individually modest, collectively transformative. And that kind of greatness is genuinely harder to recognize and remember than the kind that arrives in a single dramatic peak. We are culturally wired for narrative peaks. We want the climax, the turning point, the moment where everything crystallizes. The Ramcharger story doesn't give you that. What it gives you instead is something arguably more valuable: a model, a demonstration of what happens when you apply genuine intellectual rigor to a domain that everyone else is approaching with talent and instinct alone. The answer, it turns out, is that you win. A lot. And you keep winning even when the conditions change, because your advantage was never really about the specific conditions. It was about the process. This is where it gets really interesting from a broader perspective, because the Ramchargers weren't operating in isolation. The 1960s were a period when systematic, data-driven approaches were beginning to displace intuition-based decision-making across multiple domains simultaneously. In baseball, early precursors to what would eventually become sabermetrics were beginning to question conventional wisdom about player evaluation. In football, film study was becoming more rigorous and more central to preparation. In business, management consulting was professionalizing the application of analytical frameworks to organizational problems. The Ramchargers were part of a broader cultural moment, the arrival of the engineer's mindset in domains that had previously been governed by feel. And look, drag racing was a particularly pure test case for this transition, because drag racing, more than almost any other motorsport, is about measurable, repeatable performance. You run the quarter mile, you get an elapsed time, you get a trap speed. The numbers don't lie, and they don't get distorted by tactical racing or pit strategy or tire degradation over long stints. It's as close to a controlled experiment as you can get in a competitive environment, which made it the perfect laboratory for the Ramchargers' approach, and which is why their advantages were so durable, because the feedback loop between what they tested and what they learned was tighter and cleaner than it would have been in almost any other form of racing. There's one more dimension to this story that deserves attention before we close it out. And that's the question of what the Ramchargers represent for the relationship between manufacturers and motorsports more broadly. Because their semi-official status, not quite factory, not quite independent, turned out to be a genuinely productive organizational form. They had enough institutional support to access real resources, without enough institutional oversight to slow down their decision-making. They were accountable to results rather than to process. They could try things that a formal corporate racing program would have required committee approval to attempt. That organizational sweet spot is incredibly hard to maintain deliberately. It existed for the Ramchargers partly by design and partly by historical accident, the AMA's no racing agreement creating a context where official factory involvement was officially discouraged, which paradoxically created space for this semi-official hybrid form to thrive. When the agreement collapsed and factory racing became fully formalized again, the organizational form that had made the Ramchargers special became harder to sustain. Official programs came with official structures, official budgets, official oversight. The creative freedom that had powered a decade of innovation got gradually bureaucratized. Here's the thing about legacy in motorsports. The victories get remembered. The records get archived. But the most durable impact is almost always cultural and methodological rather than statistical. The Ramchargers championships from the 1960s are footnotes now, known to historians and hardcore enthusiasts, but not part of mainstream sports memory. What isn't a footnote is the approach they pioneered. Every modern professional drag racing team operates with data acquisition systems, systematic testing protocols, and engineering analysis that would have been recognizable to Tom Hoover in 1963, even if the specific technology would have seemed like science fiction. The culture of treating racing as an engineering problem first, then a competition second, that culture exists in the sport today, in large part because the Ramchargers demonstrated so powerfully that it worked. The funny car category they helped invent generates millions of dollars in sponsorship annually. The chassis and suspension principles they pioneered are embedded in the design of every modern purpose-built drag car. The Hemi engine architecture they validated on the track became one of the most recognizable names in American automotive history. These aren't small contributions, they're foundational ones. So, the next time someone asks you about the most influential teams in American motorsports history, and they mention the obvious names, the big NASCAR dynasties, the famous IndyCar programs, and the legendary sports car teams, remember a group of Chrysler engineers who spent their weekdays designing family sedans and their weekends rewriting the rules of drag racing. Remember that they were so good, the rules had to change, multiple times. Remember that they invented a category by accident, shaped an industry on purpose, and left a legacy that outlasted the corporate support, the rule changes, and even the team itself. The Ramchargers never got a monument. They never got a Hollywood movie. They probably never expected either. They were engineers. They expected their work to speak for itself. And 60 years later, if you know where to look, it still does.